Hello, my name is David Driscoll. In this video, I want to talk about feedback, giving feedback to employees. And implicitly here, the content of this video can also be used by people who are receiving feedback. So I think you'll see the connection there. Now, there's many models for giving feedback and doing performance appraisals. And from 40 years experience, I would suggest to you they all work to some extent, and none of them work completely for everyone in all circumstances. The key is to find what works for you, maybe a mix and match model, and use that. You want to avoid cultish models. That is, models that say, hey, if you do this, this will always happen. That's never a true statement. Find what works and use it. What I want to do in this video is simply give you some basic don'ts and do's for giving feedback. I would preface that by saying the best feedback is that which is continuously available and linked to situational behavior and performance. This is a basic model of working with any organism, that as soon as you can give it feedback, the person feedback, after they've done some performance activities, demonstrated some behavior, as soon as you can do it, the better. The more there is a delay, the less effective it's going to be. So try to get it close. And it's continuously available. This means that it's situationally oriented. This whole thing where people have these scheduled feedback sessions, that can work, and you may want to do that. But at the same time, as a supervisor, as a manager, if you see performance, if you see something, say something. That's basically the model. And formal performance appraisal should be a kind of roll-up of the situational feedback. Performance appraisal occurs maybe once or twice per year. That should be where all of the situational feedback you've done rolls forward into a more formalized process, perhaps with a rating system or some kind of quantification approach. So let me get into some do's and don'ts, and I'm going to start as I usually do with some of the don'ts. And by the way, I may look down to look at my notes. I want to get this right. I've talked about that in other videos. I hope it's not a distraction. I want to get this right. So here are some don'ts. Don't review performance only looking for flaws. This may seem obvious, but very often in my experience, supervisors, managers tend to focus on the negative side of the equation and very often give less feedback and express less interest in the positive side of the equation. So look for the balance. I'll say this later again. Even poor performers have some positive elements to their behavior and performance, and the most negative performer has positive attributes. The most positive performer has negative attributes. Don't dump your feedback on the employee and then ask for questions. I've seen this happen repeatedly, where the supervisor, the manager has done all this preparation, comes in, basically just dumps it on the employee and says, do you have any questions? Giving no chance for a dialogue between you and your employee, the person to whom you're giving feedback. Don't simply present a prescriptive direction. By that I mean, don't walk into the feedback session saying, well, here's what you need to do. You might instead walk in and say, here's the situation. What do you think you ought to do? How might you handle this differently the next time? To engage the employee in the feedback process. And just as an aside to this, don't walk into a feedback session and tell the employee not to be defensive. That's going to be a signal to them that they absolutely should be defensive, that you're about to drop the hammer on them. So don't ask or tell the employee how to feel. Don't present any change-oriented feedback without giving examples, explanation, and offering, again, that opportunity for dialogue. Giving examples is a very powerful teaching tool, and in one sense, the feedback encounter is a teaching opportunity. Don't do all the talking. Don't lecture. And again, I think oftentimes if we're giving feedback, our temptation is to simply hold forth on everything we've observed, give our opinion, and the employee sits there simply as a recipient. You want to have a dialogue. Don't use leading or rhetorical questions or statements. So, for example, don't you think that you could do this? Or don't you think this would be a better way? These are not truly questions. They're statements disguised as questions. And they're a positional statement by the presenter, by the supervisor or the manager. Instead, ask the employee, what might you do in this circumstance? Don't claim to understand the employee's point of view. Demonstrate your understanding. I have a whole video in this series on listening. And listening is not saying, I understand, I know what you mean, I hear what you're saying. Listening is developing an empathic response, a response which clearly proves and demonstrates that you've listened. Don't trivialize the employee's point of view. So if an employee says, for example, well, I'm concerned I may not be able to do this, or I'm worried about this, or I'm afraid of this, and you say, oh, don't worry. That's a denial of their direct expression. And oh, by the way, it doesn't work. If you're dealing with somebody who's concerned or afraid or worried, and you say, well, don't worry, it's not like their worry goes away. So instead, you want to use the empathic reflection. Let's talk about what worries you. All right, so those are some of the don'ts. Let me give you some of the do's. Look for effective employee behavior. I've already said this, but in every employee, you're going to find both positive and negative attributes, and you don't want to have an entirely negative feedback sessions nor an entirely positive feedback session. All employees have an opportunity to improve, and all employees are doing something very effectively. Spend as much time preparing for the good feedback session as the poor feedback session or the negative session. I've seen this happen repeatedly where the supervisor, the manager will spend hours preparing for what they envision as a troubling or challenging feedback session. And when they come to the employee who's performing really well, they spend far less time. They believe they have to spend less time with the good employee than they do with the poorer performer. That's not fair. Spend as much time developing examples of where the employee did well as you do spending time with the poor performer on what they didn't do well. Let the employee present his or her point of view and opinion. Again, open that dialogue. Explain to the employee, if the employee is unable to do so, why specific performance criteria are important. So, for example, if the employee is routinely late, let's just use that as an example. In every other way, they're a satisfactory or even better than satisfactory employee, but they're consistently late. And they say to you, well, I don't need to be on time. I get all my work done before I leave. So what does it matter if I'm not here exactly on time? Well, clearly it matters, but they don't understand why it matters. So you may need to explain that it has an effect on other employees, that there's an obligation to be at your job, ready to work at the assigned start time. Give the employee time to digest the coaching or the feedback session. If you give feedback to someone, then they don't necessarily want to hear it, that it says, hey, you're not doing this right, and we need to talk about what you need to do differently. That employee will almost inevitably be defensive. It's a human characteristic. Give them time to digest the feedback. So you might, in the feedback session, present and say, look, we'll stop now. I'm going to give you time to think about this. Come back with some ideas. Give it some time. Don't expect the employee to go, geez, thanks, supervisor. I'm so glad you gave me this feedback. I'm going to go out and change my behavior. It doesn't work like that. Conclude the meeting with mutual understanding and a follow-up action. I just gave you an example of that. So if you've given change-oriented feedback, you might say to the employee, look, go out, think about how you might integrate this into your performance or your behavior. Let's come back with a plan. We'll meet tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. I'll be thinking about it in the interim so that if you don't come up with a complete plan, I'll try to offer some additional insight. So now we both know what we're doing and when we're going to do it. Here's 3 actions you can take after having listened to, observed this video. 1, get input from someone who you've given feedback to in the past, ideally not a current employee. So if you've been a supervisor or manager for quite some time, go to somebody who used to work for you and have them assess your feedback skills. Maybe up against this list of do's and don'ts. Before a difficult feedback session, practice with a colleague relative to all the do's and the don'ts, or practice with a fellow manager. Practicing what may be a challenging session won't guarantee your success, but it does increase the odds in your favor. Think of a generally poor performer. What do they do well? I've talked about this now 3 times in this video, that poor performers have good things, great performers have things they need to work on. So I challenge you to think of somebody who's having a performance problem or a behavior problem. Try to find something they're doing well. You can build off of that base a lot easier than simply focusing only on the negative. Think of a really good employee and what do they need to work on. So those are some do's and don'ts for giving feedback and some action steps you can take after having watched this video. There's more videos in this series relative to the feedback session. Got a whole video on listening, on body language, on tone of voice. So watch this channel, and there's more to come. Thank you.